This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Quiet Riot.
Hello, Quiet Rioters. This is Andreou. Yesterday, the German federal election took place, their equivalent of our general election, and as expected, the CDU-CSU Conservatives won, with the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, coming second on roughly 1/5 of the vote, which will give them, on the provisional result, just under 1/4 of seats in the Bundestag, the German parliament, 152 out of 630. The new chancellor will be the CDU's leader, Friedrich Merz.
As soon as possible, we need to get a viable government together in Germany, a government capable of working based on a majority, because, ladies and gentlemen, the world outside is not going to wait for us.
Alice Weidel, the leader of the far-right AfD, celebrated doubling their share of the vote.
We have doubled our votes. They wanted to cut them in half. The opposite has happened. And I must say one thing. Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government, to implement the will of the people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
To help me get behind the headlines, I spoke to the London bureau chief for the ARD, the multi-award-winning journalist Annette Dittert.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome back to Quiet Riot, Annette.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
With a little bit of variation within the margin of error, the result was broadly as expected. The framing since last night on UK media has been very much 1 in 5 voters voted for a far-right party. But does that slightly obscure the fact that 4 in 5 did not?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the problem with reporting in Britain on European countries, and especially on Germany. I mean, British media have partly overestimated the danger of the far right. And I think then everybody was like over the moon that it didn't come as badly as expected. I think you have to look at it differently. I mean, the AfD came in with 20%, which is a lot. And it's worrying. But it hasn't changed much from what it was like a month ago. So the Elon Musk and JD Vance support, and that's the good news in this, hasn't made a big difference. And they have more or less got what everybody thought like 2 months ago. So they couldn't really grow anymore. And that's the good news, I think. And the other very good news is that the voter turnout was almost 84%. I mean, imagine that. That's the highest turnout since the unification. So that is really good news and shows that democracy is pretty much alive still in Germany, and the civil society as well.
If you were to paint a 5-sentence portrait of the person who will be Germany's next chancellor, Friedrich Merz, what would the highlights be?
Merz has been out of politics for quite a while. He's been working as a corporate lawyer in the private industries. That had a lot to do with him falling out with Merkel. They were real enemies, politically and personally as well. I mean, if there's something like a political personal enmity, then that was between the two of them. But it was also political, because you always thought that Angela Merkel pushed the party way too much towards the Social Democrats, way too much towards the center. And that's what his mission now is, wanted to push it back to the right again, which is a legitimate idea. The problem and the mistakes, or let's say the mistakes he made during the election campaign, in my view, was that he has pushed it way too much towards the far right. He's been pandering to the far right narratives. He's been very divisive. I personally think, and there's already some criticism from within his own party, that he would have got way more votes if he hadn't done that. Because Merz won these elections, but if you look at it with a sober I mean, 28% isn't that much. And they had expected to get in with 30% plus, and he hasn't got that. And that has to do, I think, with him being, nasty as well towards everybody on the left of his party and also on the left of German society. On Saturday evening, in his very last speech, he called all those mostly younger Germans who were in the streets to protest against the far right and really keen to protect democracy. He called them left-wing loonies. He made some crucial mistakes there, and this will be discussed within the Conservative Party as well.
And their percentages have actually overall slid downwards during his leadership. He doesn't seem to have strengthened them. He seems to have weakened them.
One thing I would like to add, Alex, because that's interesting. If you look at the numbers and how the voters have shifted from which party to which party, then you can see that he hasn't won any voters from the AfD. He hasn't won them over, which was always his justification for pandering to the far right. But he has mostly lost those votes. So that's quite interesting as well. As always, we've seen it here in Britain. This strategy doesn't work for a centrist Conservative Party to pander to the far right.
It doesn't work for anyone, and I think there are lessons for the UK government too at the moment, who seems to be moving in that direction. Has he expressed any policy thoughts in terms of the war in Ukraine, NATO, and the Trump White House, which is the hot issue at the moment?
Yes, he has, and that was the most important thing, I think, yesterday after the results had come in. He was asked about how he will now position himself towards the US mostly. And that was really, really interesting because he's been much firmer and clearer than most people have expected that. He said, quotation marks, for him, the absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the US. That is quite something from a conservative leader who will be the next chancellor in Germany, who's always been a transatlanticist. That is a massive shift he made, and that shows that he's very clear about the challenges Germany and Europe will have. And I personally thought this was rather reassuring because he was very much tiptoeing around that issue during the election campaign, which is understandable. But immediately after the results came in, he came out with this very clear and firm reassurance that he will cooperate with Macron and the Poles and also with Starmer to get Europe into a better position when it comes to the defense in general. How he will do that money-wise is another matter.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Still looking at the result, the Liberals, the FDP, they have collapsed by nearly 2/3 in terms of their share from last election. And because in the German constitution there is a 5% floor, unless you reach 5%, you don't get any seats in the Bundestag. This means they go from 91 seats to 0. Why were they particularly punished, Annette?
I think personally that this is rather good news. The Liberals have been mostly destructive and are the party who's mostly responsible for the collapse of the traffic light coalition. So I think this is rather good news for Germany. That has to do with the leader who has stepped back yesterday evening, immediately after the results came in, has tried to push the Liberals from a liberal democratic party towards the far right as well. And when you look at the numbers, you can see that he as well has lost most of his votes to the AfD. So again, this has proven to be a bad strategy. And I think in opposition, the party will probably find back to its old liberal democratic roots more. And I think that's the main reason why they lost so much.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because we'll come back to some more notable aspects of the results. But so the most likely outcome is the so-called Grand Coalition, which is the center-left and center-right party working together. And what I'm hearing from you is that you think that might be more stable than a three-party coalition, which is what we've had the last couple of times.
Yes, definitely. It's pretty clear from what I've heard this morning that this is the definite outcome. That, I mean, you never know how the coalition talks go, but the Social Democrats, the party of Olaf Scholz, of the previous chancellor, who came in with a very disappointing result, have said that they're open for coalition talks, and the conservatives, the CDU under Friedrich Merz, who will be the chancellor, has more or less made it clear that he will try to form a government only with them. And yes, I think this is the much easier way of forming a coalition quickly. It would have been much more difficult if Merz had to get in the Greens as well, which would have been the only party from the Democratic center he could have approached, because the Greens and the right-wing quarters of the CDU don't really get along very well. And that would have been difficult. And I think, especially when you look at foreign policy, a two-party coalition, Social Democrats and the CDU, will be much easier to form. And I think they both are much closer to each other, especially when it comes to increasing the defense budget. The SPD with a new leader, because Scholz will not be the leader anymore, which is also good news because he's been really not a very good chancellor. So most probably the now defense minister, Pistorius, will be the next leader of the Social Democrats, or the vice chancellor.
And he's very popular. Like, I'm seeing numbers for Boris Pistorius that you don't see in politics very often. He's got like an approval rating of 80% or something.
He's the most popular politician in Germany. That's why it was so weird that the Social Democrats didn't have him as their main candidate, but Scholz insisted on staying. And now he had to really go, because that didn't work at all for the SPD. They had their worst result in many, many years.
Is there any sense in Boris Pistorius holding back, actually, to stay clean, let's say, for the next election, and put in a sort of transitional leader for the Socialist Democrats? You know, there will be some backwash from the coalition. There always is in the compromises you have to work for in the coalition. There is always a reputational damage, right?
I think Pistorius did not push for being the chancellor candidate this time, because he thought it's maybe safer to wait and see. And also Scholz insisted on doing it again. I don't know about him thinking already about the next elections. I think that is quite a long way to go. I think he will most probably become the vice chancellor, so he will cooperate or work together with Merz. And I think on defense and foreign policy, they're not very, very far apart. So that's good news, I think. But I don't think he's thinking ahead that much at the moment.
Quiet riot. Quiet riot.
Another notable aspect of the result is Die Linke, the Socialist Party. Now, they're a descendant of the old Communist Party in the East, but have become much more mainstream recently. They nearly doubled their share, and they're predicted to get a whopping 64 seats. Now, considering that Sarah Wagenknecht only broke away from Die Linke last year and has taken almost 5% of the vote, but not quite, which means she also gets no seats. What do you make of that development?
I mean, that was the real surprise of this election. I mean, it was a proper rebirth. Nobody would have thought it could even happen a few weeks or months ago. And that is mostly down to Merz again, because the Linke was mostly supported by very, very young voters who suddenly woke up after Merz started to pander to the far right. And these young people who voted for the Linke, that they were the majority of these hundreds of thousands of Germans on the streets over the last weeks. And this was a reaction, I think, towards what Merz did. So he's basically responsible for the rebirth of Die Linke, which is quite ironic in a way. But it also had to do with the Greens going more and more towards the center after having been part of a government that was more centrist, and sort of losing their appeal to the younger, left-leaning, socialistic thinkers and the youth. And The Linke, they got more than 20,000 new members over the last 6 weeks, and the average age is 28 years. And I think no matter what you think of Die Linke, this is a really good thing for democracy, that you suddenly have the youth back voting and being engaged. This was partly, and that was also really interesting, also down to one young MP, Heidi Reicheneck, who's 36 and became a TikTok star. So she managed to become super popular, and by explaining on TikTok how to get rent reduced, by explaining how you could reduce the cost of living crisis, being really practical and fighting the AfD in the social media world very successfully. They were completely surprised themselves. 8.5%. I mean, I wouldn't have thought that possible, even 4 weeks ago. So that was quite good. In general, I think it's important to say that Die Linke is not a hard left or radical extremist left party. As you explained earlier, after Sarah Wagenknecht and her people left Die Linke, sort of the very radical pro-Putin quota is out. And they are, I mean, those who are still in the Linke and who are voting for the left are standing firmly on democratic grounds. It's just a socialist party, yes, but they're not extremists.
So she has done them a favor, basically, by leaving. She has
Yes.
effectively transformed them into a more mainstream party. There's been this weird effect that there's a slight fracturing of the vote at the results level, but because of this 5% floor for getting MPs, the seats in Parliament have actually slightly been consolidated, which is why you can now have a two-party coalition. But it also means that Die Linke, together with the AfD, have what's described in the German constitution as a blocking minority. Can you explain that bit a little bit?
That has to do with the German written constitution. Whenever you want to change something within the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in parliament. And AfD and Die Linke together have 1 seat or 2 seats more than a third. So they can prevent the centrist parties or the government to change anything constitutional. The problem for Merz now is that one thing a previous government, I think it was still Merkel, put into the constitution, a rule that they enshrined in the constitution in 2009, was to limit government borrowing and keep the structural deficit at 0.35% of the German GDP. This means that Merz, who will now have to increase defense spending massively, cannot easily rely on reforming this so-called debt brake, because it's within the constitution and can only be changed and reformed with the 2/3 majority he doesn't have. So that will make his life more complicated. There is ways around that, so I don't think this is a massive problem, but it will make it way more tricky for him, especially when it comes to getting defense spending up, which is one of the first and major challenges he now has.
Jürgen Hart, a CDU member of the Bundestag, said this on Radio 4.
We try to win back voters, unconfident voters, former Social Democratic or Christian Democratic voters that are now voting for AfD. And we have now 4 years to convince them that it is better to stay with us and not with AfD if they want to have solution for the challenges in the economic situation of Germany, in the security situation of Germany, and also in the situation with the migrants. And I think the new government has the chance to halve again the number of voters for AfD for the next election, and I'm sure that AfD has now reached its peak in Germany and will not succeed any longer.
Is that denial, do you think, Annette, or is it a reasonable reading that the AfD really had quite a lot going for it this time round?
I mean, that's a bit difficult to really assess now properly. We will see in a few years' time. I'm less optimistic, I'd say. I think you can argue they reached their ceiling because the whole support they got from Musk and JD Vance, I mean, they're really good at social media and they have a huge following on TikTok. All that didn't lead to them expanding over 20%. But the problem now is they have 20%, and they have, especially in East Germany, in some regions over 40 and almost 50%. So that means they are a massive political factor. And they will now govern from the sidelines. And the biggest problem Merz will have is something which is partly his own mistake, because he promised, especially when it comes to migration, that he would close the German borders. I mean, he took over a lot of the anti-immigration attitudes or narratives of the AfD, and he will not be able to fulfill that now together with the Social Democrats. They will not close Germany's borders because that is against EU law. The Social Democrats will not do that. So he now will have to dial down this rhetoric, and the AfD can easily triumph now from the sidelines and saying, you see, he stole our policies and now he can't even deliver on them. And they started doing that even yesterday evening, straight after the results came in already. So this will be very difficult. And this might increase support for the AfD over the next years in a way that nobody can foresee at the moment. But I'm not as optimistic at this as this Conservative MP you quoted.
So is there a danger then, with the Liberals out and the CDU, CSU being pulled to the right by AfD, and the Social Democrats being pulled left by the danger of losing votes to Die Linke, that they kind of pull apart and leave the center of German politics completely unrepresented?
I mean, in a way, you can't have a more centrist government than a grand coalition.
Yes, that's true.
It's the center left and the center right having to form a government now. I think there is a big risk that the far right will be able to present itself, AfD, as the only true and real opposition and constantly nag at Merz's moves and attempts to sort out migration policy, because he will only be able to sort out the problems Germany has with immigration. There are problems. He will only be able to sort them out together with the Social Democrats when he does step-by-step reform European immigration policy. And that is a long and tedious process, but it's the only way forward. And the AfD will easily sit on the sidelines and throw one bomb after the other at him and undermine the grand coalition by saying this is not what the people wanted. They wanted a coalition with us and the CDU. This coalition will now have 4 years to prove that they can do something from the center. But there is a huge danger that over the next years, the AfD will massively profit from them being too slow and not effective enough. Because, I mean, practical politics are a complicated, tedious affair. And far right-wing populists always have an easy game with attacking a centrist government for that. So in a way, they will be in a slightly similar situation to Keir Starmer here.
Deliver or die.
Exactly, deliver or die. And even if they deliver, you don't know what happens because, I mean, Biden in parts delivered in the US and you see what happened then. I mean, it's going to be very difficult, but I mean, yeah, I'm a bit more pessimistic, but I wouldn't say they've reached their ceiling. But I think there is also, to look at the glass half full, there's also a fair chance that these two parties will be able to convince the German majority that their way is the only way forward.
Okay, one final question. Germany has been seen as a little bit absent from the center of Europe during this really quite difficult period, especially in terms of foreign policy. Do you think this election means, especially since Macron's authority is coming to an end, that Germany now has a chance to take back its leading role in Europe?
Yes, I think on foreign policy and on European policy, I think Merz is a really good candidate. He will be able to work together with not only Macron for now, who has already welcomed this change massively, because with Scholz, they didn't even speak to each other properly. That didn't go well at all, which was bad for Europe. And Merz has already announced that he will seek a very close alliance with Tusk, with the Polish prime minister, which is also very important because Poland obviously is the one country that invests most in defense at the moment. And Friedrich Merz is a European politician. He's worked in the European Parliament. He's a transatlanticist. I mean, without the US now, he still is somebody who believes in Germany being part of a Western alliance very strongly. So I think when it comes to Germany's leading role that is so important in Europe and has been so neglected by Scholz, Friedrich Merz is really good news here. And I'm sure he will very much change the image of Germany within Europe. And Europe is really waiting for that as well. So I think that's the best news. I mean, when it comes to foreign policy, I think Merz could be a really big improvement to what we've seen over the last years in Germany.
Annette, I can tell listeners that you're booked to come on the main episode of Quiet Right in a few weeks' time, when we will hopefully have a coalition, a shape, a cabinet, some clarity on
You're
Ukraine.
very optimistic here.
But we will have some policy positions to discuss for sure. But I am hugely grateful to have your thoughts on the result today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex.
There is no point denying that this is a historic moment. A far-right party has won 1/5 of the vote in Europe's largest economy. And let us be clear, we're not talking about Reform UK here. Björn Höcke, the AFD's leader in Thuringia, and many believe the real leader of the AFD movement, whom a court in 2019 decided was not libelous to call a fascist, was just convicted for the second time of using Nazi slogans. This is someone who advocates, and I quote, a large-scale remigration project built on a policy of well-tempered cruelty, and has been designated a right-wing extremist by German security services, along with several other prominent figures within the AFD. The new White House and its bro-oligarch backer Elon Musk are sympathetic to this party and will work to boost it. Not to mention that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping would like nothing more than a disintegration of the European Union from the inside out. But let us also take note of the fact that 4 out of 5 Germans did not vote for them in what was a record-breaking turnout. Let us not give in to nihilism and fast forward to a dystopia that has not yet happened. I have been hearing that Le Pen is a shoo-in as the next French president since the early 2000s, when this was being said about Marine Le Pen's father. Europe finds ways to resist when it needs to. Essential to the far-right's advance is the narrative of inevitability. Essential to resistance is a clear-eyed view of the facts as they are, but also an acknowledgement that we are not the passive recipients of history, but active agents within it. Nothing is foretold. The future is being written collectively by all of us. If you appreciate Quiet Right as much as it appreciates you, and you think the work we do is worth doing, you can support us from as little as £5. Head over to ko-fi.com/quietriotpod to do so. Keep safe, keep sane. This is Alex Andreou. Until next time.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.